to one of the doctors who's part of an activist group who are campaigning on climate change issues, for instance, and they were linking the bushfires and the smoke we've seen around Sydney in particular over recent weeks to climate change and demanding action because of the health risks involved. We had quite a spirited discussion yesterday. I'm joined now by Dr. David Adler, who's been a Vice President of the Australian Medical Association and has a different view. Thanks for joining us, David. I appreciate it. Do you have any concerns with doctors and doctors' groups getting involved in these sorts of activist campaigns?
Absolutely, Chris. It's an interesting phenomenon we've got of recent times, which you might call the leftist activist doctors. Now, of course, doctors are entitled to express their opinions as anyone else in the community can do so. But we need to make it very clear these people are straying well outside their training, well outside their expertise. I can assure you that a medical course consists of subjects like anatomy, pathology, pharmacology. It does not consist of meteorology and geology and oceanography and any of the other climate-related sciences. So there was a classic example on your interview, which you referred to in your introduction, where there was a conflation. And when you hear someone say, as a doctor, and then continue into a political theme, warning lights go on. So it's reasonable to say, as a doctor, I want to make a comment on the hazards of smoke in the air. No one's arguing with that. But then she went on to say, therefore, climate change is causing bushfires, which, you know, is completely outside their expertise. I don't claim to be a climate expert, but I've heard the arguments that the majority of our bushfires are either deliberately or accidentally caused by people. So it's a nonsense, and it distresses me as someone who's devoted some years of their life as a representative of the mainstream medical profession that this is actually an inappropriate leveraging from the status and credibility of doctors, and it's undermining the medical profession in my view.
Now, I'll come back to some of those policy issues in a moment, because whether you're a doctor or you're a nurse, you're an accountant, you're a bricklayer, you're unemployed, you've all got a right to engage in the policy debate and say what you think this country should do on climate change. But the point here is, firstly, the medical one. Now, obviously, when there's heavy smoke haze around regional towns or Sydney, obviously that's not particularly good for health. How dangerous is it, and does it compound? I mean, for instance, is it okay if you actually have to put up with this for one day? Does the health risk compound when there's repeated exposure?
There are groups in the community that are particularly vulnerable, and they are well known. They're asthmatics, they're people with chronic airways disease, the frail elderly. They're the sort of people that need to take particular precautions. For other people, the advice is just to be sensible, not to engage in vigorous exercises on high-risk days when there's a lot of smoke in the air. So that's the general theme. It's not rocket science, and no one's arguing with that. That's not the issue. We have to take precautions when those hazards are around.
Look, there were a lot of precautions too. In fact, I think across the Sydney Basin there was an overreaction. My kids' cricket was cancelled, for instance, and it was a perfectly fine morning. We ended up going out with the kids and playing cricket regardless. So there's a bit of an overreaction by authorities, I think, in this age of risk managers and a class legal action. But obviously there are health risks there. But and a couple of days in Sydney were particularly bad. But most of the time, even with the smoke haze, Sydney's air quality has been far superior to what the poor people of Beijing, for instance, put up with every day.
Well, this is another paradox of the position of these leftist activist doctors. There are very poor communities in the world where, for example, their internal heating is through fires. burning wood, burning rubbish, burning animal dung, and there are more people who are suffering as a result of the health effects of that than there would be, for example, in using Australia's clean coal to generate electricity and to provide them with quality heating. So I think that we have here a transition away from proper medical assessment and into a political agenda. Now, it's fine for doctors to get involved with politics. We saw it with Karen Phelps. We've seen it with Brendan Nelson. You know, doctors do get involved in politics and should state their positions, and they can participate. But what was a real concern in your interview is that someone who purports to be a representative of the medical profession without any expertise, then taking a very hard extremist political advocacy line, and that transition in my view is inappropriate.
It's a very important point you brought up. I didn't get to mention it yesterday in that interview because we got sort of heated and carried away, but I dug out all the research on that, and of course most people who suffer from the effects of air pollution these days, and the area where the effects on people is going up is indoor pollution. As you say, people in poor countries burning all sorts of things to heat themselves, and the best way to reduce that is to bring dispatchable energy to them, in which case they stop burning stuff inside their house. So initially, as you say, coal-fired power, gas-fired power is actually going to improve the situation immediately, and air pollution around the developed world, in countries across Europe, North America, including Australia, air pollution has been reduced substantially over the past 20 or 30 years. There's no doubt about that, and there's all sorts of studies that bear that out. But I wanted to get onto this policy issue, and my guest yesterday focused on the fact she's a doctor, she knows science, and was demanding that Scott Morrison do something to fix this. You're a doctor, you have a science background there. Now, anybody can do the math on this. How on earth is there anything that Scott Morrison, Anthony Albanese, Richard Di Natale for that matter, anyone in this country or this nation as a whole, how could we do anything that would actually change the climate to such an effect that it would actually reduce the bushfire severity in this country?
Well, you're right. And the argument of scale has been made concerning Australia many times, and a lot of people seem to ignore it. On certain issues in the world, we can provide leadership, but we need to recognise that on this, we're the proverbial drop in the bucket. You could close down Australia completely overnight, and we know that the growth rate in China and India in a period of perhaps 6 or 7 months would replace Australia in its entirety, so in terms of CO2 output. So I think it's a bit ingenuous to make that argument. If we really wanted to improve the health status of people around the world, we would encourage the export of Australia's clean coal, we would investigate nuclear power, and we would help lift people out of poverty around the world. Look, it needs to also to be stated that more people around the world die of cold than from heat-related stresses. And the old pneumonia in the middle of winter amongst the elderly is still a major problem, and it still kills hundreds of thousands, millions of people around the world. So these issues seem to be overlooked. We've had a decline in deaths from natural disasters. We've had an increase in life expectancy. So I think we are overstating the health effects of an emergency, a crisis, etc. The data just does not support that.
Thanks for joining me, David. I look forward to seeing your sensible comments just disappear into the ether and not be reported by any other media anywhere anytime soon. I appreciate it. Dr. David Adler there, who's the former New South Wales Deputy of the Australian Medical Association, showing that not all doctors get their political slogans from Twitter. We are going to